let's talk about the movie that almost got horror banned. Not Dracula, not Frankenstein, not even Freaks. This was a 1935 Universal film called The Raven, starring Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. The Raven was so disturbing, violent, and psychologically twisted that it triggered a national panic. It helped bring the Hays Code hammer down harder on horror, and it temporarily ended the golden age of the Universal monsters. But today we have the vision to appreciate it as one of the most underrated and influential horror films Universal ever made. Torture devices, sadistic surgeons, Edgar Allan Poe-inspired madness, studio drama, power struggles, and Bela Lugosi in one of his most terrifying performances ever. This is the shocking story behind The Raven, a movie that changed horror history. I'm Antonia Carlotta, and this is Universally Me, the channel for all things Universal and classic horror. My family started Universal Studios, and they made the Universal Monsters, and they made The Raven. The Raven isn't a faithful adaptation of the Edgar Allan Poe poem, and that is putting it mildly. The movie does pretty much open with Bela Lugosi reciting some of its most famous lines, the rapping at my chamber door. But after that, other than the odd reference here or there, The Raven is pretty much out and psychosurgical horror is in. Bela Lugosi plays Dr. Volin, a brilliant but unhinged surgeon who's obsessed with Poe, torture, and a beautiful young dancer named Jean. He falls in love with her after saving her life in surgery, but when she doesn't return his affection, he snaps. Volin invites Jean, her father, and some other guests to his house for a weekend getaway, which is an invitation nobody should have accepted. They all knew his weird, intense vibes going into it. So of course he tries to kill them in his torture chamber, filled with devices inspired by Poe's stories like the pit and the pendulum, with a giant swinging blade and walls that literally crush in on you. The stuff of nightmares. As if that weren't creepy enough, we also have Boris Karloff in the film as an escaped murderer named Bateman. He goes to Dr. Volin hoping to get a brand new face to start a fresh new life. But instead, Volin disfigures him and forces him to do his bidding. So just to recap, we have obsession, mutilation, psychological torture, Poe fanboying, and the dynamic duo Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff teamed up together. And The Raven is one of the few mashups where Bela Lugosi gets the meteor role, but Boris Karloff still got the bigger paycheck. Bela plays Dr. Volin in a way that feels relatively modern. He captures the right narcissism, charisma, and absolute creeps. I feel like I've rejected guys like him in the real world and then been very worried about what might happen to me. It makes me very uncomfortable. This wasn't just your typical 1930s monster movie. There were no supernatural beings, no magic, just pure sadistic evil. And it freaked people out. Now let's put it in context. Horror was hot in the early 1930s. Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, and The Black Cat had all been hits. But there was growing concern from censors and moral crusaders who believed these films were too dark, too gruesome, and too unhealthy for audiences, especially during the Great Depression when tensions were already high. A lot of people thought that these horror movies would have too much influence over the public and they might act out what they were seeing on screen. Then came The Raven. The censors were keeping a close eye on it from the start. Parts of the script had to be rewritten for code approval, and they had to guarantee they wouldn't show Bateman's surgery. Again, this wasn't a supernatural horror film. This was all very real. And the Hays office warned that the stark realism ran the risk of excessive horror. But I guess Universal got away with a little too much in production because The Raven came out and headlines were nasty. One critic called it the most unpleasant picture I've ever seen, saying it exploited cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was seen as depraved and dangerous, and the chorus of voices got louder that horror was corrupting society. It was worst abroad. It was outright banned in China, the Netherlands, a few Canadian provinces, and then the United Kingdom. The British Board of Film Censors, after The Raven, banned all horror. England was an important market for Universal Films, so this ban meant something. Universal crossed a line it shouldn't have, and The Raven marked the end of an era. Universal stopped making horror films from 1936 to 1938. The monsters vanished from the screen, and the franchise, or the genre, that Universal had just spent half a decade building, crumbled. But was The Raven really that bad? I mean, kind of, yeah. And it definitely planted the seeds for the future of horror, so maybe the censors were onto something. For a movie that probably 80% of classic horror fans have never seen, its legacy is legitimate. The Raven centered a human villain who used science and psychology to torture others. He's brilliant, charming, and absolutely predatory. And his house is a true house of horrors. If this sounds like something out of Saw, that's because it is. Jigsaw was just a more modern, industrialized Volin. Even movies like Seven or Hostel owe something to The Raven. Psychological horror driven by a mastermind. Remember the absolute frenzy Saw caused when it came out? That's what The Raven was. I think The Raven is also the first surgical horror film. I can't think of an earlier one, can you? It's also body horror, that fear of being altered without your consent, the same kind of fear you find in like The Fly or Human Centipede. When I look at this film in the context of my own family, I can't help but think that The Raven probably had a part in them losing Universal. Like, yes, Showboat was the actual film that forced them to sell the studio, but The Raven putting a halt to horror and cutting major income streams through censorship and backlash couldn't have helped. But even if it did contribute to the end of the Laemmle era at Universal, I can't help but love it. It shook audiences, it got banned, it nearly ended a genre, and it directly and indirectly inspired generations of horror filmmakers who saw its potential and pushed it even further. How powerful, how meaningful does a movie have to be to do all that? So go watch The Raven, and as you watch, don't think of it as a forgotten film or as just any mashup between Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. Think of it as a horror film too dark, too twisted, and too real for its time that still echoes through the halls of psychological horror today. Tell me in the comments if you think Bela Lugosi is scarier as the supernatural vampire Dracula or as the sadistic Dr. Volin. Don't forget, paid members on YouTube and Patreon are getting tons of bonus videos, pictures, and more. It's the best way to support Universally Me. Share this video with somebody who loves Saw or Seven. And make sure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell so you never miss a video, and tap the like too, just to show your love. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.